Hi, I'm Kegan Chandler, and welcome to Exploring Religion. And welcome back to our series on Tenrikyo, a Japanese religion, and a movement which scholars class among the Shinshukyo, or new religions, or new religious movements. In our previous episode, we introduced Tenrikyo and explored the extraordinary life of Nakayama Miki, the foundress of this unique faith. In this episode, we're going to be introducing the scriptures of Tenrikyo, namely the three texts which form a triad that we can call the three scriptures or the sangenten. And we're going to talk about these scriptures relative to the concept of divine inspiration, automatic writing, and also against the theological background which Tenrikyo theologians have constructed regarding their metaphysics. We're going to explore how all of that interfaces with this idea that Nakayama Miki was inspired by God in some sense to compose some of these scriptures. And along the way, we're also going to discuss some of the faith's important positions within their social hierarchy. However, if you are not familiar with Tenrikyo in general, I do recommend that you watch our other episode, Introducing the Faith and the Life of the Founders, first, if you want some more context. But I'll do my best to give you a quick summary here or a refresher before we talk about their scriptures. Nakayama Miki was born in 1798 in a farming family in what is now called Tenri City in Nara Prefecture. Nakayama lived during a time of great social upheaval. There were rampant problems with the government, with the economy, and so peasant revolts abounded. She was raised in the Jodo Shu or Pure Land Buddhist tradition, but she was also influenced, as were many of at this time, by a rich blend of other spiritual practices, including Shinto, Shugendo, Shingaku, which is a Neo Confucian inspired popular movement, Kogaku, possibly ancient learning movements, and possibly even emerging new religious movements like Nyorai-kyo and Kurozumi-kyo. However, before the founding of her faith, which again is supposed to be built on a unique revelation from God, despite her previous religious background, but her early life was rather typical of a rural Japanese woman of the time. She was married at 13 to Nakayama Zenbei, who was a respected landholder, and she raised her family and engaged in community rituals and reportedly also acts of charity. But all of this changed in the year 1838 when, during a healing ritual for her son Shuji, Miki experienced a divine possession. A deity suddenly overcame her. Later, this god was identified as Tsukihi, or Tenryo no Mikoto, or Oyagami, or God the Parent. And this god proclaimed itself to be the true creator. And this god announced also that he had chosen Miki as his shrine. She was to be the shrine of God. This was a transformative moment in her life, which launched Nakayama Miki's divine mission, in which she spread a message of universal salvation. She emphasized divine healing, of course, the concept of monotheism. And she advanced also a unique creation narrative, a story about the creation of human beings. And she ultimately emphasized the pursuit of what she called the joyous life, or the yokigurashi, and also the coming world of the joyous life, yokigurashi no sekai, a world which would ultimately be transformed by God's inspiration of humanity. So, in order to support this mission, Nakayama Miki eventually disposed of her possessions and descended into poverty. This was all initially met with some resistance by her family, but evidently they got on board with God's program and helped her to dedicate the rest of her life to teaching and healing on the orders of God the Parent. And during her career, she did face significant opposition, including imprisonment multiple times by the local authorities. But Nakayama's teachings, nevertheless, spread very widely. And so, after her passing in 1887, at the age of 90, her legacy endured. And in 1908, Tenrikyo gained official recognition under Kyoha Shinto, though it later would distance itself from this category after World War II, once there was more religious freedom allowed. And from that point onward, Tenrikyo asserted its own distinct identity. But eventually, by the 1970s, Tenrikyo boasted around 2.3 million followers worldwide. And today, that number has dropped significantly, but it still retains an estimated 1 to 1.5 million members, with a strong presence in Japan, obviously, which is home to about 15 to 16,000 churches, and also expectedly a strong presence in places like Brazil and Hawaii, which have sizable Japanese populations. So that's a brief introduction, as brief as I can give you in this episode. But like I said, if you are interested in more about Nakayama Miki and the story of the founding of Tenrikyo, then you should definitely check out our other episode. Now, in terms of Tenrikyo scriptures, again, as I mentioned, there are three main texts which are used to this day, and each of these weren't necessarily around during the at the beginning of the movement, but they now form a triad of sacred scriptures. These remain in a special category, since in different ways they are believed to be divinely inspired through Miki's role as God's vessel, or as the shrine of God. And the first I want to talk about is a text which is written by Nakayama Miki herself. This is the Mikagura-uta. The Mikagura-uta was composed by the foundress between the years 1866 and 1882. So they weren't written down all at once. And these are actually lyrics. They formed the lyrics to to songs which are used in Tenrikyo rituals. For example, the Kagura service, which is the main ritual, and also these lyrics compose the words for the Theodori collection of songs. Now, interestingly, at one point, the Japanese government censored some of these songs and made the Tenrikyo community edit out parts of them. For example, a few monotheistic sounding portions, like the terms Moto no Kami, God of origin, and Jitsu no Kami, God in truth. But all of these songs have since been restored after the improvement of religious liberties in Japan since the 1940s. But anyway, that's the Mikagura-uta collection of songs. The second text is called the Ofudesaki, which translates to tip of the writing brush. This is a very important text. These are supposed to be the words of God the Parent dictated through Nakayama Miki while she was filled with God's presence. So you could consider it a form of what scholars call automatic writing. It is God himself who is dictating these words, or who has overcome the personality of the writer to some degree, so that we can say that it is God who is composing this text. And this is a fascinating work. I do like this book. I've read the whole thing through several times. It's all written in hiragana, so that's nice. And it has 1,711 waka, or short poems. They're very interesting, but the text is also very repetitive. So you can read it just once and probably feel like you understand it fairly well, or you understand its main themes. And like the Mikagura-uta, the Ofudesaki was not written all at once. It was composed between 1869 and 1882. And I mentioned the government persecution and the editing of certain text earlier. Government persecution actually led the Ofudesaki at one point to become a secret book. One of the Tenrikyo leaders reported to the authorities that all copies had been burned, which was the government order. But the Tenrikyo followers had secreted it away and preserved the text. And then after World War II, Tenrikyo brought the text out and then began to publish it widely. And this is a fantastic edition. I've got my hard copy of it here. This has gone through several versions, but the most common one here is this, which is based on a 1998 translation. Although I think this one was published, they did a big round of them in 2012. Yeah, that's right. The fifth printing is from 2012. Um, but this edition is fantastic because it's printed in English, Japanese, and in Romaji. So it's super helpful, very accessible. And again, like I mentioned, the original is all in hiragana anyway, so it's very digestible. And I'm actually not sure if you can get a hard copy of this online, but you can certainly read a digital version of it. But I got this version and a massive stack of other Tenrikyo literature at the bookstore, which is near the headquarters if you ever travel there. But I thought it would be helpful, just so you could get a sense for how the Tenrikyo scriptures sound in this introductory episode. I thought I would read a short passage for you from the Ofudesaki. And probably Ofudesaki 1:1 is as good a section as any. And also because this section actually is used in the Mikagura-uta, the collection of songs I mentioned, and is the lyrics for the song Yorozio. So with this passage, you'll actually get a sort of 2-for-1 view of two of the scriptures. Now, remember, these are supposed to be the words of God. This is a revelation from God the Parent. This is the voice of God the Parent who is speaking through his shrine, Nakayama Miki. Okay, so the text begins this way. Looking all over the world and through all ages, I find no one who has understood my heart. So should it be, for I have never taught you. It is natural that you know nothing. At this time, I, God, reveal myself and teach the truth of all things in detail. You are calling this place the Jiba, the residence of God, in Yamato, but you may not know the origin. When you learn of this origin in full, a great yearning will come over you, whomever you may be. If you wish to know and will come to me, I shall teach you the original cause of all things. As God is revealed and teaches the truth of all things in detail, the minds of all in the world will become spirited. As I am in haste to save all of you quickly, I set out to make all minds in the world spirited. And by the way, this last line, Sekai no kokoro isame kakarite, this can be translated inspire the hearts of the world. Spirited, that's a bit vague of a translation to me. Inspired, I think, is really the best way. God the Parent is setting out to inspire all of the hearts and minds, or the kokoro, the heart mind of all people, to awaken them, to reveal to them the origin of all things, the origin of humanity, and ultimately God's intention to save them, that is, to introduce them to the joyous life and ultimately to the world of the joyous life. So, yes, very interesting passage. And I think this is exemplary of the Ofudesaki as a whole, because we already see a lot of Tenrikyo themes here. There is the creator God who reveals the original cause of all things, the creation of the world, which you heard takes place at the Jiba, or the divine residence, which becomes central in Tenrikyo, and which is said to this day to be located at Tenrikyo headquarters. So you can actually go and visit the site where Tenrikyo says that God first created human beings. And also in this passage, we heard once more of God's plan for salvation, that he's working quickly to save all of humanity. This is a repeated theme in the Ofudesaki. I went through and counted them at one point. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but there are dozens and dozens of passages in which God says that he is working quickly, he's hastening, he's getting ready to save everybody. And also, we get a sense from this passage and from the book in general that this is a universal concept of salvation that is dawning for humanity. God is interested in saving everybody. And so I think quite a lot of this passage captures the spirit of the Ofudesaki and of Tenrikyo as a whole. But now I do want to speak further on the significance and ultimately the nature of the Ofudesaki. And we're going to use this text to also talk about subjects like divine inspiration. So, among Tenrikyo's three scriptures, the Ofudesaki holds a place of particular prominence. It's often regarded as the most significant because, again, it conveys the direct words of God the Parent, which were transcribed through the hand of Nakayama Miki. And a leader in the Tenrikyo hierarchy, the Shinbashira, he once explicitly described the Ofudesaki as revealing, quote, the most important principles of the faith, end quote. So even within Tenrikyo, the Ofudesaki is seen as having a foundational role, which serves as the bedrock for other key instructional works, which would later be composed by the organization. For example, the Doctrine of Tenrikyo and the Life of Oyasama, both of which draw heavily on Ofudesaki verses. However, in the Tenrikyo educational curriculum, the Ofudesaki is typically reserved for later study as a standalone text. And this sequencing reflects, I think, a few assumptions. The first of all, that the Ofudesaki is complicated theologically in some ways. It's thought to have a meaning which is best grasped or even only grasped after students have built a solid foundation in Tenrikyo theology and so in text like the Doctrine of Tenrikyo and the Life of Oyasama. Without this context, the Ofudesaki is seen as possibly leading people in the wrong direction. Without and maybe without proper guidance, you could get a wrong view of, for example, the nature of God. And I do think there is no greater example than this regarding the concern of official Tenrikyo theology. That's the question of the doctrine of God. I'm not going to talk too much about monotheism in this episode, but I'll say that in the Ofudesaki's creation myth, there is a narrative about how God the Parent actually creates human beings. And in the course of this story, it is mentioned that there are these many deities. There are 10 names of deities or kami that are presented in this story. But in official Tenrikyo theology, there's a peculiar interpretation of what these names actually signify. Namely, they are not to be interpreted as real deities or literal kami. Rather, they are interpreted to be impersonal principles or metaphors, what they call the providences of God or the instruments of God. And this is a major point of discussion in Tenrikyo theological discussion, and also in Tenrikyo's engagement with Western scholars who have tried to analyze its doctrine and the developmental history of its doctrine. But this is a major reason why official Tenrikyo curriculums would have you read the Ofudesaki later, rather, and after you have a solid foundation in other educational works. Nevertheless, it is clear that the Ofudesaki stands, again, as I said, the bedrock of Tenrikyo theology. Now, moving on from this Ofudesaki text, the third and final sacred text of the triad is the Osashizu, or Divine Directions. This was a text written by Iburi Izo, who was the second spiritual leader after Nakayama Miki. When the foundress Nakayama Miki died, or as they say, when she withdrew from physical life, the movement was shocked. They were not expecting this at all. They had originally believed that the foundress was going to live to at least 115, which is the ideal human lifespan described by God the Parent. However, she did pass away at 90, and so there was a tremendous shock and some disputation within the movement. However, Iburi Izo had been a key disciple of hers, and he ended up taking over as a medium, and he channeled Nakayama's spirit and then became the vehicle for further revelations from God the Parent. So that's what's written here in the Osashizu. These are revelations given to or through Iburi Izo, and there are many, many of these revelations. It is it contained in 7 volumes with nearly 20,000 of these short writings given between the years 1887 and 1907. And all of these weren't physically written by Iburi Izo, although some of them may have been. Rather, they were penned by scribes who were taking all of this down as he was dictating. But there's no English translation of the entirety of the Osashizu, unfortunately. That would be a very large undertaking. But there is an anthology of translations or sections which you can get in English. And here's a copy of the one that I got in the bookstore. And it does have English and the original Japanese text on opposite pages. Very helpful. But I want to say a little bit more about Iburi and his position. I mentioned he was the second spiritual leader, and that's true in a way. But he has a very interesting and controversial history. He took up a position which Tenrikyo theology and history calls the Honseki, or the main seat. However, this was not without controversy at the time. Prior to Nakayama Miki's withdrawal from physical life, some disciples had looked on Iburi as just another one of their comrades. One moment he had been a carpenter, a humble servant of the foundress, and then the next thing people knew, he was moving into the residence and was being consecrated as the main seat of God's ongoing revelation. And so you can get a sense in the records of the controversy. And of course, this is what happens in many, if not most, religious traditions around the world. After the founder passes on, there is a struggle over who is going to be the successor and over how the religion is going to be structured in terms of its power, in terms of its teaching authority. So this is not surprising at all. But this position of the Honseki is interesting because it only exists in Tenrikyo for a short period of time. There was a controversy after Iburi, after his passing as well, in terms of who the successor would be. After this was the year 1907, and there was a claim that this position was supposed to pass on either to someone named Ibaragi Motoyoshi or to someone named Ueda Naraito, who was a woman who had been adopted by Nakayama Miki while she was alive. And then there were some claims that were made about Ueda's alleged insanity. And anyways, I won't get into all of that interesting history, but ultimately the Honseki position was dissolved. And so it is said to not be in effect anymore. But today, there is still a position called the Shinbashira, or the central pillar. And this is the ongoing patriarch of the religion. And today, you can see I have a photo on the screen here. Nakayama Zenji is the fourth and current Shinbashira of Tenrikyo. And he's held the office since October 25th, 1998. And Nakayama Miki herself in the Ofudesaki speaks about the Shinbashira. She speaks about this position several times. This was imagined by her to be a position which would settle matters of dispute within the body of faith. And on the screen here, I put a couple of examples. She says, truly the hastening in the mind of God is to put the central pillar quickly. So this is something God the parent also wanted to install. Another text, it says, if only the pillar is firmly established, the whole world will truly settle. Sweeping the innermost heart of everyone in the world, God is hastening to show the central pillar. At this time, after purifying the water, I desire quickly to take in the Shinbashira, who will settle matters within. If only the central pillar is quickly put in, everything will be settled firmly forever. So you can see the practical function with this, which this position is supposed to serve. But also in the Osashizu by Iburi Izo, this text also announced the importance of the Shinbashira. And I put one example here on the screen. It says, sa, one word from the Shinbashira rather than 1,000 words spoken by others. And that's from the entry from May 26th, 1906. So this is a position substantiated by the central text themselves, by Nakayama Miki herself, and therefore by God. And so the Shinbashira continues. But as I said, this Honseki seat of divine revelation is no more. Now, Um, some views would say that maybe this or that person should have been appointed, and I could get in maybe another time into the history of schisms and breakaway groups, some of which have to do with the issue of succession. I could get into all that another time. But in official Tenrikyo theology, again, the Eburi Izo, the mouthpiece for the Osashizu scriptures, he was the only one to ever hold this position. Okay, so for the rest of this episode, I want to talk further about the nature of these sacred writings. And I'm going to be turning back mostly to the Ofudesaki in particular as the foundational or bedrock text of the religion. As I mentioned earlier, this is a work that was penned directly by Nakayama Miki herself, and so from that vantage point can be considered her own work. And this is a fact that is touted by Tenrikyo theologians and members as a point in their favor in the context of comparative exercises or interreligious dialogue. This is used as a means of trying to establish the superiority of what their religion has to offer in terms of its sacred text versus the scriptures of others. For example, I have a quotation here from Ueda Yoshitaro, who is the Honbuin or the headquarters official. And it says this quote, "The fact that Oyasama, that's what they call Nakayama because she herself is like a parent to them. Oyasama personally committed the teachings to writing. Or this fact is, I believe, extremely significant. For example, in Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, which are called the world's three great religions, their scriptures were compiled a long time after the passing of their founders. Consequently, there's the question of authenticity. Also, in some religious traditions, offshoots and branches have arisen because of disagreement, as if this hasn't happened in Tenrikyo. In contrast, the fact that the foundress herself wrote the Ofudesaki means that the scripture is an absolutely reliable guide whose authenticity is unquestionable. These were comments delivered in 2008. Now, in addition to this, the Ofudesaki, in addition to it being viewed as the writing of Nakayama Miki, as I've mentioned several times, these are also understood to be the words of God. I said earlier that the Ofudesaki can be considered a form of automatic writing. This is a kind of text in which the human subject is not the one who is understood to be doing the writing. They're not writing by their own will. Rather, it is through the will of a deity who is controlling the pen. In the anecdotes of Oyasama, entry number 22, Nakayama Miki says this about her writing. She says, "You know, there is the Fudesaki." And by the way, that's the Ofudesaki. The O is just an honorific. "You know, there is the Fudesaki. What do you think of it? The 17 parts of the Fudesaki were not completed in a short while. God spoke into my ears, saying, 'Do not look at any writings, even the charge book from a bean curd shop.' I wondered why. Then God said, 'Brush, brush, take up the brush.' I took up the brush for the first time at New Year's when I became 72 years old. And when I took up the brush, my hand moved by itself. From heaven, God did it. After what was to be done was finished, my hand became numb and it could not be moved. God said, 'Calm your mind and read this. If you find something you cannot understand, ask me.' I added brush strokes when I found something I could not understand. That is the Fudesaki." Okay, so very interesting. You see primarily that this is understood to be a form of automatic writing in that it is God who is literally moving the brush as Nakayama is working, although she has left room for the fact that there are some emendations, some additions, although it's going that were from her own interpretation after asking God for clarification. Of course, discerning which sections belong to that category is going to be very difficult. But all of this raises the question of divine inspiration in general and possession, and what all of this would look like from a metaphysical standpoint, from the view of Tenrikyo theology. And this question about the metaphysics of possession, this extends not just to Nakayama Miki, but also to the Honseki, Iburi Izo. This is what we read from God in the Osashizu penned by Iburi, or perhaps dictated by Iburi. God the Parent says this: "When I have entered the Seki," that's the Honseki, "he is God. But when I am not within him, he is human." That's from April 12th, 1907. And here's another instructive passage. "He," the Honseki, "is utterly unaware of anything while I am talking freely in this manner. God is speaking freely by entering him, that is, by removing his mind and replacing it with God's mind. Seki's mind is totally unaware of anything." And that's from May 30th, 1907. So it's pretty clear in this text that this automatic writing is performed by way of a total possession or a total control of the subject. In the case of Iburi, it seems that it's only when he was sitting in this main seat in order to deliver the revelations, that's when he became possessed. But it doesn't seem like he was possessed at other times, when he was just walking around. And this seems, in my view, to contrast with the experience of Nakayama Miki, who is said to have been the shrine of God, where God truly was living and dwelling. God was said to be in Nakayama Miki in a unique and ongoing and very profound way. And this makes sense because these are different roles. There is Nakayama Miki as the foundress, as Oyasama as the parent of this faith, but then there's also the successor, Iburi Izo, as the Honseki. These are different positions. But I want to now talk about Nakayama Miki and about how it could be that God entered into her and delivered these revelations. How could it be that God was possessing her? Maybe you think this is not too interesting or surprising of a proposition if you're familiar with other religious traditions and the way that they think and talk about possession. But from a metaphysical standpoint, this gets very interesting in terms of Tenrikyo theology. The reason is that on the one hand, we can imagine maybe what we're familiar with in other religious traditions. You may imagine a substantial spirit of God or a divine being that's entering into someone's body and possessing them from the outside. But this simplistic picture gets a little challenging when you think about possession from the standpoint of Tenrikyo theology, in which it is said that the world is the body of God the Parent. The world is the body of God the Parent. This is an explicit teaching in the tradition, and you may have heard this in other contexts. There are many theologians and philosophers outside of Tenrikyo who have used similar language. They've said that the world is the body of God when they are describing views which some scholars would describe as forms of pantheism or panentheism. And I'll get more into all of that in another episode. But what I want to say here is this: Tenrikyo theology generally presents God as both transcendent and immanent in the world. The world and human bodies are part of the divine body of God. Humans borrow their bodies from God. That's how it's conceived of. This is the doctrine of a thing lent, a thing borrowed, kashimono, karemono. However, human minds are said to be distinct from God. So human persons, the mind or the personality of the human being is not thought to be blended into the divine body of God. So there's a real distinction between human beings and God the Parent at the level of the mind or the individual personality. But human bodies are fundamentally related to God, or we might say, on my interpretation, ultimately indistinguishable from God. So this is an interesting question, or I should say possession, the picture of how possession works becomes an interesting question from this perspective if we're talking about something entering into the body of someone whose body already is God. So some Tenrikyo theologians, in light of all this, they have described Nakayama's possession in a different way. They've talked about her experience of God entering into her as something that spiritualizes a spiritual unity rather than a literal indwelling. So on this view, Nakayama becomes a mediator, an exemplar for humanity's own potential oneness with God. So this is a view which would reject a strict pantheism in which all things are identical to God, and leans towards a panentheism in which Nakayama Miki has her own mind or personality, which is distinguishable from that of God. And yet, this is a person who is invited or inspired by God to align themselves mentally and spiritually with the distinct mind of God the parent. So you can look at Nakayama Miki as the shrine of God, and you could justify that unique position in the sense that she's someone who was able to align herself more with God than others, to get on God's divine wavelength, if you will. Or perhaps God unilaterally aligned her spirit with his. That seems to be what's going on in the official story, at least regarding the possession on that night in October of 1838. But we'll talk more about metaphysics in the future. But what I want to do now to close out this episode is to contrast Tenrikyo's view of divine inspiration for their scriptures with Christian theological models of divine inspiration, which I'm assuming that most people in my audience are going to be more familiar with. And I'm doing this because I'm interested in the comparative enterprise in general, but also because sometimes Tenrikyo has been accused of borrowing from Christianity. And so I thought it would be interesting in this discussion of scripture and divine inspiration to see how the general understanding of Tenrikyo theology on this point would line up with basic categories in Christian discourse. Now, again, what I'm about to say are gross generalities. There's significant variation on the question of divine inspiration of the scriptures in the Christian tradition. But I think this will be helpful nonetheless. Christianity offers several models of scripture, each with parallels and contrast to Tenrikyo's approach to what was going on with Nakayama Miki and Iburi Izo. And again, these are not all of the models of Christian interpretations of scripture, but just a few that I think will be helpful for this discussion. So first, Christians speak about verbal plenary inspiration. So in this view, in some extremely conservative Protestant traditions, typically, the Bible is considered to be the literal word for word dictation of God to human beings. They might rely on passages like 2 Timothy 3:16, all scripture is God breathed, and they take that in a very particular sense to mean that the writers of these documents are passive conduits. Their personalities are largely irrelevant to God who is penning this text, and therefore the text is inerrant because it's literally coming down from heaven. Comparing this with Tenrikyo, this model closely resembles Nakayama's and Iburi's automatic writing, or at least the parts which would not be interpreted as their commentary or elaborations. But when these individuals were possessed, especially we can see this quite clearly in those texts from the Osashizu regarding the Honseki. These individuals are serving as direct transmitters of God's words with very little, if any, personal input. We read how the mind of Iburi Izo was, completely displaced, and so this mirrors the ideas of divine dictation, which are present in this verbal plenary inspiration view, in which every word of this book is really authored by God at the end of the day. Another popular Christian interpretation is called dynamic inspiration. So the view here is that God inspires the ideas or the concepts, but it's human authors who are expressing those ideas in their own words. And those words that they're using reflect the personalities of these authors, their cultures, their historical contexts. This is a divine human collaboration, if you will. Contrasting this with Tenrikyo again emphasizes total possession rather than a collaboration, although it could be said that there may be some portions of the Ofudesaki which could be seen as a sort of divine human collaboration, wherein Nakayama asked God for clarification on certain parts of the divine revelation, and she would receive that clarification and then write some additional words. So it may be best to view the Ofudesaki, at least, according to the anecdotes of Oyasama, as largely a something which was dictated more along the lines of the verbal plenary inspiration model, again as a form of automatic writing, but then some aspects might be seen as a kind of dynamic inspiration, although maybe one worked out through literal dialogue in prayer between Nakayama Miki and God the Parent. Anyway, hopefully this comparison was interesting to begin to think about not only how Christianity and Tenrikyo compare, but for understanding the perspective of Tenrikyo theology and their understanding of divine inspiration. Okay. So I'm going to conclude this episode here, but I'm looking forward to talking more about some of these subjects that we've covered, including the specific doctrines contained within Tenrikyo's scriptures and within developed Tenrikyo metaphysics. Statements like the world is God's body. This is all very interesting and worthy of further discussion. And we'll get into all that at another time. But until then, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I'm Kegan Chandler. If you enjoyed this content, I would invite you to please like the video, share the video, and ultimately subscribe to the channel. All of this really helps our small channel to really get going. Looking forward to talking with you again and exploring religion in the future. Until next time, again, I'm Kegan Chandler. Thanks so much for joining us. Take care. Bye-bye.